everybody out there in our methods course. I'm not alone today for our listening lecture. I'm actually joined by several students. Could you each introduce yourselves?
Hello, my name is Svetlana Kushner-Chuk, and I'm a senior. I'm going to graduate in June.
My name is Rachel Musser. I'm Spanish Elementary Education and ESL.
I'm Josie Ledbetter, and I am an ESL minor.
Okay, so I'm lucky enough to get some help. And why can't I do this lecture alone? Because when you're thinking about the skill of listening with your students, you have to be thinking about their role in participating in their own listening development. If you're only focusing on what you as the teacher are doing, you're missing most of the equation. So if I didn't have these students helping me, I couldn't give you this lecture today. So what I'm going to do is to start out by asking them to discuss among themselves. So now you know the lecture is going to be about listening. Why don't you make some predictions about the kinds of things you might hear me say? So you can just talk among yourselves.
Well, if it's about listening, maybe we're going to be hearing something from the lecture and discussing what it is that we notice, like maybe certain words.
Yeah, keywords. I was thinking of the same thing.
Keywords. Yeah, verbs, vocabulary.
See, if we understood what we were listening about, then we would see formality or informality, different word, like conjugations kind of thing.
Maybe we'd even have some questions about what the content was in what we're listening to, like just to see if we actually understand what we're listening to.
Okay, great predictions. Excellent. And I think you'll find that many of them do play out. So we'll find out in a little bit. But the first thing I want to do is I want to play a few, less than a minute, of a lecture or a speech that's being given in Greek. And what I want these three to do, and for you listening, if you didn't do as I asked and watch this clip before this lecture, I want you at home to be noticing, what are you noticing about what you understand or what you don't understand or how you're trying to make sense? I'm assuming that no one is actually fluent in Greek. Okay, let me go ahead and hit play. And we're not going to listen to the whole thing, just the first minute.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ κύριε Πρόεδρε, κυρίες και κύριοι βουλευτές. Είναι τιμή για μένα να μιλώ στον ναό της Δημοκρατίας της Ευρώπης. Σας ευχαριστώ θερμά για την πρόσκληση. Είναι τιμή μου να απευθυνθώ στους ερετούς εκπροσώπους των λαών της Ευρώπης σε μια κρίσιμη στιγμή τόσο για την πατρίδα μου και την Ελλάδα, όσο όμως και για την Ευρωζώνη και για την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση συνολικά. Βρίσκομαι ανάμεσά σας λίγες μόνο μέρες μετά την ισχυρή ετυμηγορία του ελληνικού λαού, μετά την απόφαση που πήραμε να δώσουμε τον λόγο άμεσα.
Okay, so let me put the screen up. Alright. Turn this off. There it's gone. Okay, and I'm back. And what I'm going to ask these three is, what did you notice that you were trying to do? Or what did you notice about that language that for most of you, you don't know any of?
I think I was listening for cognates, like words that like sounded similar to how they sound in English. Like there was one that was like democracia or something like that. It sounds like democracy, so maybe.
Great. So you were trying to pick out some words that you would recognize from one of your other languages.
Yes.
Great. Anything else you noticed?
I was doing the same exact thing. I noticed it was formal because he was speaking, he was in a suit and tie, or no tie, but he was in a suit and he looked formal and he was in a place where people had headphones, so it was being interpreted.
Yeah.
or translate, one or the other.
Interpreted.
Interpreted,
Yeah.
okay.
Translation is when you're taking a document and turning it into another language. Interpreting is on the fly.
Yeah,
Oral
interpreting,
language.
yeah. And they were also talking about a crisis, maybe in theology or something, some kind of ology.
Ah, and how do you know that?
He said theologos, logos is a word or something, theology. It sounds something that from my other languages or root words learning.
Right, so very
Oh,
similar to
yeah.
what you were
Uh-huh.
doing, Rachel. Yeah. Anything you noticed about yourself?
I was definitely listening for the emphasis on the words, and specifically the pauses after the words. If they were said loudly or softly, just to figure out how important certain words are.
Excellent. And so part of the reason that I had you watch that clip is because I was hoping and betting that most of you have not studied Greek, and so this truly would be a foreign language to you. And what I wanted you to notice is how when we listen to another language, it's a constant stream of sound. Now, Josie mentioned that she was listening for the pauses, the hesitations, to try to make out where those words are. That's a very intelligent step, because what we are doing when we're making sense of language is we're figuring out how to take this non-ending stream of speech and turn it into words. And that is the crux of what we're doing when we are making sense of language. And even though, for example, Rachel was able to pick out the word democracy, or what sounded very similar to democracy, you were able to pick out the word logos. Even though when we listen to a language we know well, we think we're clearly hearing those words, they are actually all jumbled up against each other. It's just that we recognize them and we're able to pull them out and to make sense of them. And it's amazing that we're able to do that. We think that there are pauses, but usually there are not. We, for the most part, when we're speaking, especially when we're excited, when we're speaking informally, we're not actually putting in a lot of pauses. And so we are relying on our listeners just having that basic human ability to pull out those words and make sense of them. And so how in the world do we do that? Really, part of it comes down to our auditory discrimination. And let's see, 2 of you have already had second language acquisition. Josie, you haven't had, I think, second language acquisition yet. Is that right? No. And so one of the things that we talk about just briefly, like 3 seconds in second language acquisition, is we talk about, with individual differences, those of us who have a natural gift for language and those who don't. And I really de-emphasize it in second language acquisition. Why? There's not a thing we can do about it, right? That's the one thing in our classroom we don't get to tweak. And so why spend a lot of time talking about it? And another reason we don't talk about it very much is that with your amazing teaching and with students' amazing motivation, you can outrun someone with that natural ability. But being able to discriminate sounds, to naturally be able to pick out sounds, words from a stream of speech, that's actually a natural gift. And I can tell you right now, it's not one that I have. I do not have that gift. And so I'm really sensitive to watching clips like this, a speech in Greek, and I'm really sensitive to the fact of I feel like I'm on a treadmill and it's going way too fast, and I really can't get my feet underneath me, and so I really struggle with that with Spanish as well. And so I just kind of want to start there, that really it's this amazing thing that the brain can do to figure out, to pull out those words, and it helps you understand why beginners in a language struggle so much with listening. Even if they're vocabulary words you've already exposed them to, they can still struggle with that. Another thing that helps us, that naturally helps us, some more than others, with being able to discriminate these sounds and make sense of this constant stream of speech that's coming at us is our working memory. All of us have a better or a worse memory. Mine was better when I was younger, now it's getting worse. But all of us are born with a different amount of working memory. And why does this matter? Because speech is ephemeral. So when we talked about the skill of reading, we talked about how reading speed matters, because if you get to the end of the sentence and you can't remember how the beginning, what the beginning was, you can't connect subjects and verbs. And you certainly can't connect subjects, verbs, and objects. It's even more true in listening, because speech is ephemeral. That's a fancy way of saying once it's said, it's gone, right? You say it, it's gone. There's nothing to hold on to. And so the only thing someone has to hold on to is their working memory. And memories are interesting things. Here's an example. When I am listening to someone, so Spanish, as most of you know, is one of my second languages. It's the one I'm working on most recently. And when I'm listening to someone speaking in Spanish, sometimes if I'm taking notes, I can put the words from the sentence down, but they're not in the right order. And that's another kind of interesting glimpse at how the brain is trying to make sense of these sounds. That yes, I am getting many of the words, but they're not in the right order. I just think that's interesting. We are not tape recorders. I think that's one of the things I want you to notice. We are not tape recorders. And getting a sense of how much students understand is really, really key to seeing where they are in their development. And you're probably getting a sense that probably the speed of speech matters as well, right? One thing that you may have heard before is that we should always slow down our speech when we're talking with English language learners. I'm going to change that, and I'm going to say not really, okay? So research tells us in second language acquisition, when you are speaking with students who are beginners or low intermediate, it really helps them if you slow down your speech, just like I'm doing right now. But for those who are intermediate, high intermediate, advanced, it does not help them at all to slow down your speech. And so if you think about it, since they're not gaining anything by you slowing down your speech, you actually should not. Because when they leave your classroom, they will be exposed to, whether it's on television or it's the bus driver or it's the person they're sitting next to, those people are not going to be slowing down their speech. And so really you're better preparing them for the language, the natural language that they will encounter, okay? So I'm gonna stop here for a moment, and I'm going to ask Svetlana, what have you understood so far?
Okay, so when you were saying what we noticed about the video and how we're listening to a language and it's a constant stream of sound, I linked that to my Spanish linguistics class.
Yes.
And we were just talking about that. When we see words in print, we see the spaces between the words. But when we're speaking in whatever language, you're not going to see those spaces between each word. We might focus how Josie were trying to see what was emphasized, which word might seem more important, like more or colors or descriptive words. They're usually kind of more emphasized. But so that's one thing I noticed. Can I keep going?
If you want, how about one more thing?
Okay, one more thing. The word order. So we have, if we're teaching English as a second language or a foreign language or other language, pretty much those students have other languages. And I analyzed how you were saying you didn't write them down in the same order. So I think what my hunch is your grammar of your first language took over, and that's what you were writing down.
So for example, in Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun. So your hunch is that maybe one of the ways that my kind of disordered syntax is showing up in Spanish, if I do that, is I'm actually applying what I know from English. Yeah, that's a good guess.
Yeah.
That's a good guess. Rachel, what is one thing that you understood that you haven't heard yet from Svetlana?
I think kind of the talking about the memory, how once you are listening to something, when someone speaks something and you hear it, it's not repeated again unless it's in your mind. And so trying to figure out those words and things that you're trying to grasp from what they're speaking would be really difficult, especially with that auditory discrimination that you were talking
Yeah.
about. Trying to pick out maybe words or sounds. But sometimes sounds, like, they don't always help. They're just like they don't have meaning to them sometimes. So.
Do you mean like when we're carrying out active listening? So if Josie's telling me something and I'm saying, yeah, like that?
Yeah, or even like if you're learning a language and you're listening to a stream of words, like the sounds may not, if you don't know the word that they're attached to, they may not carry meaning for you, so it's hard to figure out
Yes.
where they go. So,
Excellent, excellent point. And Josie, what is a question that comes up for you, or something either that you didn't quite understand, or just a question that comes up from you for what we've talked about so far?
Do you want me to relate to the English language specifically, or?
No, anything that comes up for you, yeah.
I'm thinking in general, the formality of the speech is also important, but I think for any student learning, even English or even us learning another language, sometimes we don't always pick up words that we haven't learned yet. And so that's something I think would be really important to understand.
And I think, that's a really great kind of launching spot, that we can't pay attention to everything, right? And so that's a really good point. And I just want to throw this out, when you're listening in your first language, after you have mastered whatever it is that maybe you've mastered the area of linguistics and you're sitting and listening to a lecture on linguistics, or you know the language of the kitchen and you're listening to someone talk about their recipe, that kind of thing. You will actually not hear everything that's said. But you don't know it because your brain smooths it over and is constantly making sense. Does that make sense? Svetlana's not convinced.
No, I'm processing actually.
there you go.
And so why does that matter? Because we need to take that realization with us into our classrooms, and it gives us the confidence to say to our students, you don't need to understand everything. Because guess what? When I'm listening in English, or whatever your first language is, when I'm listening in that language, I'm not understanding everything too. It's just the way we work, because we can't, just as Josie's pointed out, we can't take in everything. And so the fact that I have 3 people here helping me with the listening lecture today should be a visual reminder to you that listening is highly interactive, and listening is a highly active, energetic process. So when you see someone just kind of sitting back listening to a lecture, or you see them with a book open, maybe they're kind of, look like they're relaxing and they're reading, it looks like they're doing nothing, right? But actually, with reading and listening, our brains are working harder than the actual active skills. It's just that we can't see it. And so your brain is grabbing onto these words, just like Josie said, paying attention to the ones you know, and trying to build meaning from what you can make out. And again, it's really important for us to know our students never need to understand everything to make sense of the meaning, okay? All right, so excellent. So what I just demonstrated, for those of you watching the video, what I just demonstrated is what's called the Quran style lecture method. And this is another visual reminder for you. When you give a lecture, don't go to the front of the room by yourself. Take some students with you. Involve them. The usual Quran style lecture has one student on the right, one student on the left, and one student says what they understood, the other student says what they still don't understand, and then you swap back and forth. So you take your lecture, you break it into pieces. So we're gonna do it again, okay? But we're gonna move on, And so one thing we know from second language acquisition about the skill of listening is that your ability in your first language as a listener directly contributes to your ability in your second language. So what I can tell you is that in English, I am a visual learner. If I listen to someone on the radio, or I listen to a lecture in which nothing is on the board, or the person is not using lots of images, that kind of thing, then what I am doing is really struggling. In English, in my first language, and so I can tell you the same thing shows up in Spanish as well, or German, or whatever second language I'm working on. So there's a direct connection between someone's strengths. So if you were interviewing someone, and maybe they're a beginner in the language that you're teaching them, let's say English, and you know their first language, you could ask them, how do you do in listening in your first language? Is that the way, do you take notes in a lecture, or do you just sit back and listen? If they say, I just sit back and listen, they are really skilled at listening, and that's gonna be a strength. If you ask me, I'll say, I'm taking notes like crazy. I'm creating charts, I'm writing down more than the person at the board is, then you'll know, boy, she's gonna struggle, right? Not that I can't make it there, but I'm really gonna struggle. So there's another connection between first language and second language I wanna make. As you've probably figured out by now, often when we're trying to understand the second language acquisition process, we go backwards, we go to what's called child language acquisition, and I've got it written down here, I don't know if you can see it, but CLA, child language acquisition, because sometimes going backwards and seeing how the first language is learned gives us insight into how we can better teach a second language. Now, I want to tell you about a researcher named Laura Ann Petito, and she is kind of a rock star in linguistics research, and she had a shining moment when she started thinking a lot about the fact that if you go around the world and you interview parents about how their children developed language, whether it's in Africa, it's a clicking language, whether it's in Spain and it's Spanish, wherever you go, parents tell about the same story, right? And doctors around the world see about the same developmental milestones. What kind of milestones? Babies babbling, babies playing with sounds, and then the change where the baby stops making all sounds and begins to make sounds that kind of sound like words in the language the baby is surrounded with. They're not real words, but they sound kind of like those words. And then the moment when the child says their first word, and then they say their first sentence. So Laura Ann Petito thought a lot about this and thought about, hey, isn't that interesting? We're all developing, no matter what the language is, we're all developing at about the same rate, and we have the same milestones, the same first steps. And she started thinking, you know who we're leaving out of the equation? We're leaving out the deaf community. We're not taking a look at how second language or first language acquisition works for signed languages. And so she did this huge research study in which she got parents whose children were deaf, whose babies were deaf, and they were exposed from birth to signed language, American Sign Language in the US. And what she did was she videotaped them on a regular basis to capture how they were producing language, what they were doing. And what do you think? For those of you here, what do you think she found? Did it match up or was it different?
I bet it kind of did match up a little bit, like that, because like if they were trying to use signs to attach meaning to the world around them, just like we use sounds to attach that meaning. Maybe there's a correlation there. Maybe, I don't know if like maybe they understood the signs or they were able to like create them correctly when they were working with it versus sounds, but.
Yeah. So your guess is probably looked roughly about the same. Do you agree?
I think this is really interesting. I think I somewhat agree and have something to add. Yes, the signs are contextualizing the input, right? And that's how we learn language, and our universal grammar, our black box is ready to accept that input. So I think, I don't know, that's really interesting, but I think it should be similar, maybe not to the same degree, but very similar.
Very similar. So we've got two leaning towards similar. What do you think?
I'm leaning more towards the different side. I'm thinking just like in very broad terms. Other countries have different types of alphabets. I know for sign language, when I took it, when they would sign, if you couldn't say a word, they'd spell it out with their hands.
Yeah.
Well, let's say you were going to Japan, they don't have the same alphabet as us.
Right.
So I can see how there could be some differences, but there might be some similar signs that we can pick up from.
Yeah. So she had no idea what she was going to find. And what did she find? Matched up perfectly. Now that raises an interesting question, doesn't it? How we know that the brain is ready to take in language. We know that it's expressing language in at the same time frame. How can signs, what's the connection between signs and sounds? And what did she find? It was temporal bursts. Fancy way of saying these little rhythmic patterns. So in other words, when you're listening to me right now, if you stop listening to my words and just listen to the sounds of my words, you're hearing 2 syllables, 3 syllables. You're hearing a burst of sounds, a pause, another burst of sounds, and that is how we sign. Signs come in the same bursts of sounds. And so what that tells us is that the brain is ready to listen to certain patterns. And once you begin to recognize those patterns of your language, your home language, your mother language, your first language, whatever we call it, that's what you're paying attention to. Isn't that interesting? And so, what does this mean for us? One of the things that makes us realize is that every language has its own particular pattern of rhythmic temporal bursts, right? Whether that's in signing or that's in sounds. And one thing I can tell you about English, it's really important for you to know, we are what's called a stress-timed language. In other words, some of our words are stressed and some of them are unstressed. And we actually talk in a beat, and the beat matches the stressed words. And listen to that. The beat matches the stressed words. I didn't give the same stress, and I didn't spend the same time on every word I just said. The beats determine the stress. Could you hear it? The beats determine the stress. So in English, when we sing songs in English, we are perfectly set up for success if we have a good lyrics writer, right? Because we're already talking in beats. Can you hear it now? And an example, some of you who've already taken a course with me, you might have heard me do this before. So listen to this. Mice eat cheese. Can you guys do this with me? Ready? Mice eat cheese. Okay, now I'm gonna add I'm gonna say it again. I'm gonna add a word. You just listen. Then the second time you do it with me. The mice will eat the cheese. The mice will eat the cheese. Now I'm gonna add some more words, some more sounds. Listen the first time, then join me on the second time. The mice will have eaten the cheese. The mice will have eaten the cheese. Do you hear it?
Yeah.
We started out with subject, verb, object, noun, verb, and noun, and that's where we put the stress in English. Why does this matter? Because for a baby who's exposed to English as one of its home languages, it's recognizing this pattern, and it is beginning to zone in and pay attention to that pattern. So when it's listening to other speakers speak English, it's listening for those emphasized nouns and verbs. Isn't that interesting? So that means that's what our students, we need to be training our students or teaching our students to be listening for too. And it also tells us why listening is so difficult. Because if something is not a noun or a verb, we de-emphasize it. We say it faster. We don't stress it. So yes, some things are really difficult to hear. Are other languages stress-timed? Yes, but English is the absolute most stress-timed. Spanish is to a far lesser degree. Spanish is more even. There's less stress on the syllables, and it's far more even. Okay. A few more things I want to mention before we move on. And I'm almost done. Do you guys have an 11 o'clock class?
No.
No? Okay, so we'll go on a few more minutes. So far what we have talked about is we've talked about how each of us, when we're born, our brain is primed for language. And each of us has a slightly different working memory, and each of us has a slightly different skill at audio discrimination. Mine I struggle with. I suspect, Svetlana, you've mastered a lot of languages. That tells me that probably it's a little easier for you. And so those are what are called individual differences. Are there other individual differences that will make life different for your students in your classroom when you're helping them with listening? Yes. One of them is whether or not they apply strategies. So do they apply strategies, especially metacognitive strategies? Are they able to plan ahead? And strategies is one way, for me as an English listener, as a Spanish listener, strategies are one way that I compensate for my lack of ability with listening. So for example, when I am in Nicaragua, I'm often in meetings in which the entire meeting is in Spanish, and it's about an English curriculum, or it's about how to teach pronunciation, or it's about how to change a program from general English to ESP, English for specific purposes. And so I'm in these situations where I'm listening sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes before it's my chance to speak. I need to understand that information. I'm not a strong listener, so what do? I plan ahead. I say to myself, what are the words I'm probably going to hear? What kinds of things might people say? I think about what I know about the people in the room and what their perspective might be. Are they going to like a new idea, or are they going to be against a new idea? All of those strategies help me prepare for success. And they kind of level the playing field for me as a listener. Does that make sense? I don't have a natural ability, but boy, my strategies can really kind of bring me through. And of all the strategies, there seems to be, SLA research really seems to emphasize that metacognitive. That means kind of planning, seeing yourself from afar. If I notice myself getting tired, giving myself permission to zone out for a minute and just not listen. Or if I feel my anxiety rising because people are starting to look at me and I know my chance to speak is coming, calming myself down. Those are all strategies that really make a big difference for me. And of course, proficiency level. As Josie said, you can't listen to everything, you're just listening for the words that you understand. So the amount of words your students are coming in with, their proficiency level, will directly determine how they do as well. So Josie, I'll start with you. So for that part of the lecture, what's one thing that you understood?
I guess definitely more of the importance of understanding a student's learning style so we can teach them in a way that they will understand.
Yeah, so finding out what works for them and then making sure they know about it, emphasizing it as a strategy that they can use. Great. And Svetlana, can you add one more thing to what you understood?
Okay, so well, I kind of want to be Skip right now.
You want to be Skip? No problem. No problem.
I don't know.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add?
I think what I found is really interesting was your discussion about strategies, because I have some ELLs that I'm working with, and so some questions I might have were like just, I guess, things that I understood was that strategies do help, and I'm thinking a lot about context and like teaching students what what context clues are and how to look for them,
Yes.
so that they can help understand
Yes.
what's going on. Because I think that's a huge part of listening is like understanding like with the video, like it was very formal. We knew that there was like it would look like a government. Like there were some things we could grab from that to help
Yeah.
with the listening.
And I want to emphasize what Rachel suggested here around context clues. A couple of things I want to say. The first is context is how we understand vocabulary. Here's something that often happens to me. I'll be at a meeting at a school in Nicaragua. I'm doing fine listening in Spanish, right? I really am. I'm doing fine. I prepared well. I'm using those strategies. I'm focusing on what I understand. And then someone pokes their head in and they say, who's cooking beans on the stove? The pot's about to overboil. Now here's the interesting thing. I know all of those words, but I often cannot understand what it means from just the lack of context, okay? And hold on a second, I'm gonna pause, hold on. Okay, okay.
I don't know if anyone is available. No one is here. If you want to
Which one? This one? Okay. I think I'll just wrap up. Can I have one more minute to wrap up? Okay. All right. Sorry, and sorry at home. Sorry at home. We're going to have to conclude. But basically what we've really emphasized is that context does matter. It makes a huge difference. And it's an amazing strategy if we can teach our students as well. So what I hope is that you got kind of a nice overview of what we know from second language acquisition about the powerful skill of humans to listen and understand language. Thank you to all of you for helping me.